So this video is going to be covering the lighting effects in Photoshop. It's sort of like using digital lights on an actual image, as if you were in real life. And if we go into the lighting folder, there are a few things in here. So one is called lighting example, and it's just saying, how you can kind of give you different words like, oh, if we use this setting, these are basically presets that are in there. But it's also talking about the different types of lights you could have and how they can affect the image. So there's this image of a map, which we can download in a minute, and you can see that some of the lights, they're the same color, but you can see these are different shapes. Whereas these have different colors, this has this weird effect, this is what the light map looks like without it, right? So you can see here the light has been set up so that there's darkness all around. There's as if it's only being lit in certain places. So this is a very, very specific effect. It'll have very specific utility, and it's also kind of tricky, but if you need something that looks like this, you'll have it. The instructions one, the lighting examples have vanished from the file, but it does tell you where you can go to get certain settings and things. So if you want to take a look at that at any point, you can. So I download the map for the lighting assignment, and it's actually a PSD file, which is very helpful. So we're going to open that up. There we go. And we can see that we have this map here. And this is going to be under filters, actually. It's a very strange thing, but it's under filters, and it's under one of the fancy filters. Give me a minute. Render. So it's under render, and these ones actually bring up like brand new windows, and it's kind of a whole thing. So if we go under lighting effects, it's going to take a second, especially since I'm dealing with recording the screen at the same time, so this might be sluggish. And for some reason, it's decided to give me 3 spotlights. This might be something I was working on before, so we're going to get rid of 2 of them. Okay, so we have this huge spotlight. You can see that the color is blue. I can change that to white. I can click on it, and it brings it up here. It's too bright right now, obviously, but because I went from a darker color to a lighter color, that's what happens. And the intensity is how much light. So you can see as I bring that down, it brings down the intensity of the light. I can also turn off this colorize thing by making this white. So that's sort of like the ambient color. So there's the color of the light, but then there's also the ambient sort of bounce color, as if I put this to a little bit more orange or whatever, it's as if we're in an orange room. And we'll get to what that means in a second. But your basic settings are the color, the intensity, which is how much light, and then we've also got the size here. Now, this is slightly tricky to deal with. Because we have a spotlight, we actually have 2 different rings. So this is like the hotspot part, which is like the really bright part, and this is the rest of, or the overall light. So this changes the ratio of, let me turn up the intensity just so we can see that. Yeah, there we go. So this changes the ratio of, there we go, how much is considered a hotspot, right? And then this changes the size of the whole thing. And you can see as I'm moving my mouse around, it's like it keeps changing what it's going to do. If I am just outside the line, it'll rotate it. That'll matter more in a second. If I'm on the line, it'll let me move it. And if I'm somewhere in here, I'll be able to scale. Here we go. If I'm on this, I'll be able to scale it. And now I'm rotating it accidentally. So you can see how this gets very tricky very quickly. And it's very finicky. It spends a lot of time caring where your mouse is, and it's very hard to, there we go. This is what I wanted to happen. It spends a lot of time. You gotta like kind of get used to where it's gonna go. All right. I can move this hotspot angle if there we go. I can move this thing here. So it can be tricky to get this to work. But if you do, then you can have in this case, directional spotlight. There we go. And I can turn that up a little bit. this turns up the intensity of the hotspot. Or I'm sorry, this turns up the size of the hotspot, which turns up the intensity because the larger it is, the more light it's shining. But it kind of gives it that look of what a spotlight would look like. So we have the exposure, which there we go. It also kind of changes the look of this light, but kind of in a different way. These things all work together, though. So if you turn up the intensity and turn down the exposure, you might end up back where you started, essentially. I'm going to skip gloss and metallic. They don't do very much. It's basically the difference of how it goes from a hot spot to a not hot spot. So if I turn the gloss all the way up, all right, here. If I turn the gloss all the way down, the hotspot trails off pretty quickly. But if I turn it all the way up, it kind of stays a hotspot for a while and then trails off. But these are very, very subtle things. The ambience or ambient light really is what it's dealing with. There's a light here and it's shining on this, but all the rest of this is still lit up. That's what happens in real life. Technically in computers, if I bring this number down to 0, no ambient light. So what happens is this light only hits where it's actually hitting. If you could imagine, this doesn't happen in the real world though, because in the real world everything bounces. Now this gives us a great dramatic effect, right? Lots of fun. I don't even know why that did that. I'm not sure what I changed to make it actually show ambient light, because it shouldn't be right now. Oh, okay, here we go. I set it back down to 0 and it goes back down. But in the real world, the light bounces around. It hits other things. So we turn that up at least a little bit to mimic the world as it is. Now, there's also a simpler light called a point light, which is just a light. It's round. It doesn't have that spotlight scenario. I can still bring this down to 0. And then let me see about bringing these out. So works a little bit differently. It kind of starts here, but it spreads out all over the place. So I would have to do like a negative exposure or ambient if I wanted to have it only light this area. And it takes a little while to get used to these, right? So it takes a little while to get used to these tools. Also, these tools all go into negative numbers. So if you go into negative intensity, you could suck light out of a room, which is what would happen if you have two different lights. So I did this in class accidentally. I had one light over here, one light over here. When I turned one down to negative, this light wasn't showing up because I was literally taking the light out of the room. And we don't want to do that. So I'm going to, just as a bit of a trick, because I think this is fun, I'm going to put it back to spotlight, and I'm going to make it circular again. Give me 1 second. There we go. Perfect. And I'm going to, nope. Yeah, unfortunately Control Z, which we get so used to over time, does not like us. Scale, rotate, scale. There we go. I want to scale the whole thing. There it is. But I'm going to make a light. And I'm going to, there we go, make its hotspot like that. Good grief. This is how you know it's tricky because it can be, even I struggle with getting this to function properly. No, I don't want to scale length. Somewhere in here to let me scale the whole thing. But in the meantime, I'm going to make the light red. So it's going to say red 255 and then no green and no blue. Because I want to show how light works. Dang it. Give me 1 second. I'm going to pause the video. Problem fixed. It would let me scale the length, but it wouldn't let me scale the width without it being squashed. And we're going to turn the intensity up to something red, but something not too bright. Now, unfortunately, I can't duplicate this light, which is ridiculous, but there you have it. So if I want a new light, I have to start from scratch. I have to say add new spotlight, and who knows what it's going to look like. It's going to look like the first spotlight I had when I started this, which is annoying. So I can approximate the size of this. I'm going to make this one, some of you already know where this is going, entirely blue. So 0% red and green, 255 for blue. I'm going to stick that there, and I'm going to check this light. I had 37 intensity, so I'm going to make this one 37 intensity. And then I'm going to make a third one. And you can see how this starts to get slightly tricky. You can see that these things are interacting with each other. The amount of light can add up to being too much. And the colors of the light interact. Nope, just kidding. There we go. So I'm going to bring this one and be 0 for this, 255 for green, and 0 for blue. And it didn't take, because that happens sometimes. I think sometimes it gets very confused as to, oh boy, what is selected. Yeah, well, let me change that. We're going to try this one more time. I should mention, while I'm fidgeting with this, there was a problem with the computers in the lab where people would turn them on, and there would be the color wouldn't let you change it at all, and they would do everything. They would push every button, try everything, and nothing worked. And what we discoveed is that you just had to turn, I swear, you turn the computer off and turn it back on again, which is the dumbest thing ever. But that is what had to happen. We had to turn it off and turn it back on again, then you could change it. And I just had that version of properties, which is I couldn't get it to work. And then I deleted the light and started a new light, and it was fine. So I'm not sure what I clicked to make it not work, but there you have it. And this is what I meant by it's very tricky and very finicky and very weird. But I have a red light, and I have a blue light, and I have a green light. And for those of you who remember my story about how the primary colors you learned in elementary school were wrong, when we combine, hello, there we go, a red light, which is a primary color, and a green light, which is also a primary color, we're going to get yellow. Come on. Just kidding. I'm trying to make it bigger instead of moving them. Some days. There it is. So as I move this over, red and green are making yellow, of all things. So we've got yellow in there, red in there, green in there. If I grab blue and move it over here, and somehow magically, nope, make this larger, you can see that blue and green are making cyan. You'll remember that we had that cyan color in the printer. I mentioned that pigments. And then red plus blue equals magenta. And of course, all three of them combined equals white light. So what we have here is a visualization of how primary colors actually work in light. So for your projectors, anything video related, green, red, and blue, RGB, or red, green, blue, there we go. But your secondary colors, which are yellow, cyan, and magenta, those are your primary colors in printer ink. That's why Illustrator works in CMYK. And because you're having to sort of add darkness to an otherwise bright piece of paper, that's why you have the K in there. Whereas light, nothing exists until you add the light. So the brightness is sort of inherent in there, whereas with the printer you have to take the brightness away, which is why there's a fourth color in there. All right, so these work the way actual lights work. If you had 3 flashlights and 3 pieces of semi-transparent film, you could do this with flashlights. All right, but the assignment for this particular exercise, let me grab this here, is to, where do I have it? I think I have it right here. Create 2 unique lighting environments using Photoshop's rendered light filter. Do not use the defaults, whatever those show up as, and rasterize the layers. So a couple things that I skipped when I started this. First of all, this is a very heavy process. I'm surprised my video editing thing hasn't crashed yet. I'll be totally honest. Um, but like most filters, which we went over in the previous video, um, in order to be able to go back in and make changes, we have to right click on this, convert to smart object. So I should have done that first, and I apologize. And now once I do that and I go to render, come on, lighting effect. I don't even know what this is. But we'll stick with this. So let's say this is the lighting I wanted to go with. I think it's an RGB thing and it's just like super huge. But let's say this is done. Now, come on. Nope. Oh, that's fun. So let's say this is done. What I can do is I can say OK. And it will save it in here as a smart filter, which means you can turn it off. But this is going to make for a very large file. I'm not even going to save this because I risk losing my whole video when it does it. But basically it will like take some time to process and I'll end up with a 100 megabyte file. Because this is outside the bounds of what Photoshop is really meant to do. These are vector lights, right? This is like Maya level rendering stuff. Obviously Maya does a much better job of rendering, and is much less clunky. But you have lights moving in what is essentially a 3D space and shining their light onto a 2D image. And then we're expecting Photoshop to remember all of those things. That's a lot of information. So for the purposes of this assignment and getting it onto Blackboard, this is probably the only time I'll ask you to do this, but right click rasterize layer. So in the previous video we'd said smart objects, smart objects, smart objects all the time, all the time, all the time. Here I'm telling you, well, okay, but rasterize the layers when you're done so you can hand it in to me. Now, technically speaking, you should probably save, a version of this file that doesn't have a rasterized layer, like save it with the smart filters to keep for yourself, generally speaking, if you ever want to make changes. It is a larger file though, so use that space up on your flash drive at your own risk. But when you're done and you want to hand it in, you can say rasterize layer and then you can say file save as and make a new file and then say Benvenuto map finished, right? And then it will be a somewhat smaller file. Now it still won't be a very small file, in part because this image is a little bit bigger. We're dealing with raster images and we've added this color information to it, so it's not going to be a tiny file, and you're going to have two of these layers on here, right? Because I asked for two in one file. Please, we should be getting used to multiple layers in our files, just like the previous assignment, but we still want to make sure they're the same. So when you first get the map in here, you can duplicate it before you add the lights in. Or if you've already added the lights in and there's still a smart layer, you duplicate it and then you just go into that smart layer or smart object. There we go. We just double click this. Come on. There it is. Takes a minute and you can go in and change it once you've duplicated it. All right. So we want two different lighting effects. They can be pretty basic. Just a lot of people put spotlights coming down from here, or they find a few point lights to light things, or they play with color. Just have fun with it, but know that these are tricky. These are not. They're very, very finicky. It's not you. It's the program. The program is very, very finicky, and it is also a little bit more likely to crash. So if you're using smart layers, you can kind of say okay, back out of the thing, and then save the file, and then go back in to make sure you save your work, right? So non-destructive editing using smart filters, and also makes it easier to get your work back should something crash.